Magister Dixit. Magister Dixit. Magister Dixit. Magister Dixit.
Welcome to Magister Dixit, a podcast that invites you on a journey into realms of expertise, imagination, and occultism. Delve deep into the minds of those that have dedicated their lives to mastering their crafts, and how having an esoteric or supernatural influence has shaped that path. In each episode, we will engage with magisters, true masters of their respected fields, as they share their unparalleled insights, unconventional knowledge, and their unique perspectives. Venture into the mystical as we converse with filmmakers, musicians, and renowned authors. Listen to their perspectives on their respected disciplines and how being a practitioner of occultism has influenced their craft. Remember, in the realm of knowledge, Magister Dixit, the master has spoken. Today, we're thrilled to dive into the captivating world of Derek Hunter, an author whose literary repertoire spans across genres. With works like anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, Derek delves into historical mysteries, offering fresh perspectives on Shakespearean authorship, while his story of Us All Trilogy weaves mythic narratives that challenge and inspire readers. Derek Hunter's writings not only entertain but also provide introspection and exploration of a profound philosophical questions. Whether delving into the complexities of human experience and his nonfiction works like Love, Chaos, and Theory and Practice, or crafting imaginative tales in his fiction, Derek's words have the power to captivate and provoke thought. Let's welcome Derek to the show. Okay, Derek, I want to welcome you to Magister Dixit, and I always like to start off with our guests telling us a little about their background, growing up, what initially inspired you to become interested in the esoteric and the occult, what influenced you to be a writer.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on here. It's very much a pleasure. I'm very grateful to be here and honored. You've had some great guests already, so it's just it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you. And I would say that I'm I'm 46 years old now, and I've been into the occult for about 15 years. So I certainly did not. I started getting into it in my 30s. So definitely there was a period where, for example, I really got into Anton LaVey and read the Satanic Bible. And
when was that?
Really, was that?
And how old were you when you read that?
I was in my 20s, my mid 20s, So I definitely, but I didn't really see myself as being. I just saw it more of a philosophical kind of thing, and I didn't have a practice at that time. I didn't actually do any rituals myself. I just read the Satanic Bible, and I did read the satanic rituals. But I didn't find it my a reason to jump in and to actually have a practice until my 30s. And so throughout my whole life, I've been searching in terms of what is sort of the truth to existence. What is my truth? What is this all about? I've just been always constantly questioning. I've never been comfortable just settling with what was presented to me, in terms of social norms, in terms of philosophical norms, in terms of religious norms, political norms. I just never felt really comfortable with the image. And I think part of this too is just perhaps coming from my family dynamics in terms of a certain pleasantness being portrayed, but knowing that there was also a good deal of trauma that was being hidden. So I've always kind of felt that appearances were deceiving. So I've always kind of wanted to just unravel what was really going on, and just not only in my own life, but in reality as a whole. So I went on a lot of different journeys throughout my life, Even a period where I was a Christian from like the age of 20, 21, 22. And I was not born into a family of any kind of religion at all.
You're born and raised in Los Angeles?
We moved around a lot when I was little. So my mother and my stepfather, we were living in Venice for a long time, Venice Beach here in California. And at that point, my stepfather, he was a kind of struggling. He used to be an actor. He actually was a Shakespearean actor when he was younger. He started off in Canada. He was from Canada and was very close friends with Jason Robards and Christopher Plummer, both of who are fantastic actors and went on to have great careers.
Quite famous, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're very famous, and for him, he was like the three of them, they were buddies, and his career didn't take off, and he got married, had kids, and then he quit the acting life, and he had quite an interesting story, but he had a lot of underlying issues that I ended up becoming a victim to as a kid, and in terms of some abuse and whatnot, and so I think because of that, whenever he would quote Shakespeare or sing he was into musicals, he would sing musical tunes and stuff, and he would do my astrological chart every once in a while, and yeah, so that was like the closest thing. My mom would take me to church when she felt like it, once in a blue moon. But yeah, I was just very kind of skeptical of anything. I thought astrology was kind of BS because.
Where do you think your dad got that from? Did he get it from his parents or?
No, he got into it. I think he met people here in LA and then got introduced to astrology that way. He didn't do anything else besides that. Like he certainly never got into any kind of ritual practice himself. That's as far as he got in terms of the occult or esoteric. I think that it wasn't something that.
But it interested in him.
Yeah, it was more of just like popular astrology, kind of really, throughout my teens, I was really on a quest to find what meant something to me, and I went through different phases, and I found a lot of value in Joseph Campbell, and the hero's journey was a big influence on me. And then I really got into, when I was in high school, is when I got into Shakespeare. It wasn't my stepfather who really got me excited about Shakespeare. It was an English teacher that got me excited about Shakespeare. And it just jumped off the page. It was just so exciting. It was just so alive. It was so electric, Shakespeare's works, and then I fell in love with not only Shakespeare, but James Joyce, and Dostoevsky and Arthur Rimbaud. They were like my heroes as a teenager. And I just found the real value of trying to live life authentically, and against the various different power structures that really were not only external but internal too, in terms of how those things are imposed on us as individuals. There's just so many different ways to trap us in terms of keeping us from being kind of like liberated, I mean, it's almost like an infinite game of entrapment. So I really like that. I really like James Joyce in particular in his journey of liberation of individuality.
This teacher really opened you up to a lot of literature and profound thinking.
This was in a school in Seattle. So this was a school in Seattle and called Nova, that was run by kind of like ex-hippies, and very much like it was based on this English school called Summerhill. And Summerhill is like almost kind of like an anarchic way of teaching kids in terms of like a lot of freedom. And so that it forces the kids to learn to be responsible because they're not really being told what to do. And so I learned a lot from that, and I really flourished in that, and then a lot of other kids that were in that high school in Seattle really flourished in that, and that's where I found a lot of passion. And as a filmmaker, I was into filmmaking in my teens and my 20s. I made some films in my 20s. I made a feature film, heavily inspired and influenced by Cassavetes Cassavetes was my hero, my friend's hero in our 20s. And then I switched from being a filmmaker to being a writer. And again, I'm still searching. Anton LaVey is one who comes across my time as well. That time, Albert Camus is another. And then just in terms of the concept of the absurd, the absurdity.
If I could just ask, what made you kind of distance yourself from filmmaking and embark a journey as an author instead?
Sure. I realized I had so many stories. I just had so many stories I wanted to tell. And it took so much just to make that one feature film, from the beginning of writing the script to the production and then the post-production and then promoting it. It was like a good 3 years of just that one film. And I got burnt out, and I was in the process of writing the script to my next feature. And I was just like, I don't want to go through this again. It just takes too much out of me, and I'm not getting it. I'm not getting to the satisfaction on the creative level that I wanted to get. So that was for me a big decision to change over to write fiction.
Process just wasn't fast enough for you. You have all these ideas coming in your head, and it's like, man, I got to get done with this one first before I could even start on those. So I can understand changing gears and becoming an author over the filmmaking.
Yeah, it really, when you're a writer, if you like to just get things done and you don't need to, and if you don't want to have to rely on others and you're kind of impatient like I am, writing is great, because then it's just all on my shoulders. It's just for me. This is it's just me. And I love collaborating, but I don't think my nature has a collaborative nature to it, which to me was very ironic when I wrote my most recent book, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, because it's about collaboration. It's about a group of people writing those works. But yeah, for where I was at that point, I was still searching heavily into the concept of intoxication. So for me, my connection with creativity was to either be inebriated, have alcohol in my system, or to be high on one drug or another. So I was very much, there was that French poet Arthur Rimbaud, one of my heroes, his idea was that to push yourself to the limit through intoxication. Once the distortion of the senses will open up a transcendent realm of ideas for you as a poet or as a writer, as a creative person. And all these things will come flooding in, and you'll be basically turned into like a conduit for all this creative energy. So I was really much about that and using substances in that way. And then that turned into some heavy drug use, and that turned into a lot of paranoia. I started to get heavily into I guess you could say, conspiracy theories about various different things. And with the drug use, it just intensified it. And I got into politics in my 20s too. I was a peace activist, and by that point, by my late 20s, early 30s, I was really kind of seeing that. I felt that the real power in the world was actually in magic, and I'd been so skeptical of magic, of anything occult. I was just really wary of it. The only thing I was ever kind of somewhat open-minded to in regards to any kind of occult work would be the tarot. And it was not my stepfather, but my biological father. And he used to do my tarot reading. And he, like me, was an agnostic. And so he was very much about embracing uncertainty, embracing doubt. And that was something that appealed with me in my 20s, but has gotten even stronger as I've gotten older, is this embrace of doubt. And so he basically introduced me to the tarot by just telling me, don't worry, you don't think of these things as like real things or fortune-telling devices. Just think of them as like psychological tools, so that you have these images, and then it's like, what kind of reaction do you have to these images and their relationship to you? And so that kind of was like the first kind of opening where I was like, okay, to like actual use of an occult practice. But it was really when I got to a certain point of heavy substance use and abuse and the paranoia, and I felt that like the people who were essentially running the world were actually practitioners of magic, and so I felt like if in this my quest for liberation, my quest for individuality would be that I too would then start practicing in doing it myself. If this was my sort of way to get out of the trap of the world, then I could do it myself. And that started opening doors. One of my favorite bands is Coil, and I love Coil tremendously. And just hearing interviews with John Balance and Peter Christopherson, and they would oftentimes talk about Austin Osman Spare or Aleister Crowley. And so I think it helped a lot that hearing people who I admire talk about, famous occultists in a way where originally when I would see Crowley, it'd be kind of like, I don't know, I was little skeptical of him. And, but once I heard Balance especially talk about Crowley in a certain kind of way, I was like, okay, well, maybe there's something to this guy. And so then that's when at that point, that was sort of the point. Also Robert Anton Wilson was enormously helpful to me, because again, being an agnostic, his approach to it as an agnostic as well, in terms of his maybe philosophy, in terms of possibilities.
The blazing agnostic, just like challenging everything.
Yes, and it definitely that helped me a lot too. And he also was another window into Crowley. So it was like a combination of like John Balance and Coyle talking about Crowley and Spare, and then also you had Robert Anton Wilson, who he actually, oddly enough, I don't know why, but he never talked about Austin Osman Spare, but he talked quite a bit about Crowley. And so getting into Crowley was really my way. But the people who helped me to get into Crowley was definitely Robert Anton Wilson and John Balance of Coyle. And then from there, it was just like this huge just transformation, then it just like my life became about magical practice. And I just started just reading and then started doing my own practices. And then I got, getting into chaos magic and Peter Carroll and Phil Hine, and just really just diving into that, Kenneth Grant, and just really trying to just find what worked for me. And I was like, well, and it was all individual. It was all an individual experience. I didn't join anything, any groups, any orders, or any. I didn't really want to do it with other people. I just wanted to do it on my own. So yeah, I did. I have done rituals with other people, with ex-girlfriends and whatnot, and but it wasn't. It was just very individualized. So I always very felt strongly that you get the power that something has is the power that you give it. So in terms of having, like, I think one of the reasons why traditions are so powerful is because when we look at those traditions, there's just so much weight behind them. So if there's a certain perception about a magical practice, it has that power to it because so many people have given power to it, but I felt also strongly that if there was like something that Crowley did that worked for him, or that Spare did that worked for him, or whoever, Phil Hine, but it didn't somehow register for me, and I tried it and it just didn't really click with me, then I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't find a use for it.
Which is recommended by chaos magicians too, to just take what works and discard the rest. I think, is that almost like a motto or something?
Exactly. Yeah. And so I was like, with the substance abuse, I was practicing. Well, I was still doing a lot of drugs and alcohol, and but that was causing a lot of problems in my life. So I thought, well, what if I used rituals to get clean and sober? So I did. And I also did other things. I went to therapy. I started going to sober support groups and doing that. And then I created my own philosophy in 2014 called Love Chaos. And so Love Chaos was something I created. It's a agnostic way of life, and that views the existence as inherently chaotic in nature. And the important thing is to focus on love within this chaotic universe. Because in 2014, when I realized like I had a problem, I was an addict. I had already been a Christian for 3 years. I already had that born again kind of experience. I've explored Buddhism as well. I explored other, spiritual paths, and I just the 12 steps didn't appeal to me. Going to rehab didn't appeal to me. So I've always loved William Blake for a very long time. And there's a quote by William Blake where he said, I will create my own system so that I may not be a slave to another man's system. And I really, thought like, well, hell, like, well, why not? Like, why not create my own mythology, my own way of life, my own of being in this world? And that's what I did.
And how do you perceive that relationship between chaos and love?
Well, I would say that a big part of that helped me was being in love. I'm still in love with the films of Cassavetes. John Cassavetes was not only a great filmmaker, but I think in a lot of ways, a really great philosopher. And the way that you watch his films, the way he was as a person, and the way how important love was for him, and the way he felt that the way to really experience love was in the dynamics of being a very awkward human being. And so he really felt that we all were very insecure. And so I think that, and he was okay with that. And he felt like there was actually great depth and joy in that insecurity in being a human being. And it could be very unpredictable and very just this unsettling. Could be a very unsettling in both a beautiful way and also a very uncomfortable way. And so that in that sense of how can love and chaos exist together, I saw he was a great example of that. And in a way where, like, even when I was doing a lot of drugs and alcohol, it was very difficult for me to get to that behavioral and emotional point that where he was at, So I definitely wouldn't compare myself to him whatsoever. I think he was a bit anti-intellectual, and I love the world of ideas, and I love the mind. I love spending a lot of time in my mind, and he wasn't like a fan of that. So I'm very different from him.
Yeah, I'm totally getting that vibe from you too, and the underlining thing in your novels is that you explore those themes of chaos and love and human evolution. And with your latest book, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, you delve into the mystery surrounding Shakespearean authorship. And, previously up until this question, you've been telling us, how you were exposed to Shakespeare. And, what was it in you that you decided to research and undertake all of this to create a novel about Shakespeare?
Well, it was a 30-year process. So it literally started in my teens, shortly after I fell in love with Shakespeare. So I had to write an essay about the life of Shakespeare. I think it was when I first really fell in love with Shakespeare, I was like 14, with that English teacher just doing an amazing job with that. Then I think it was the next year, my sophomore year, I had to write an essay about the life of Shakespeare. And by that point, I'd already just really gotten to James Joyce, and the biography of James Joyce just really, I just was enamored with. I was just enamored with his life and his story of his experiences in Ireland, and then meeting his wife, Nora, and then taking her with him to the continent, and just this whole, experience of what it meant to be who he was as a human being, trying to be identified with the Irish culture, but also rebelling against it, and just rebelling against the trappings of religion and so forth. So I was just like, wow, this is a fascinating story. and other people too, other artists, musicians that I love their stories. And then I came across the biography of William Shakespeare of Stratford and was enormously disappointed, horrendously disappointed with just like finding out who this person was. And there was no traces of any kind of artistic life, you know. I think you can even find, and it's not so much like in terms of like the job he had, and basically he was just a businessman. Like T.S. Eliot was a great poet, and he was a banker his whole life. And yet, I think you could still find some traces of some fascinating things in his life. You know, and people say there's just not enough known about Shakespeare, and what I discovered these last 30 years is that's not true. There's a ton that we know about him, but there's all these business transactions. And so it's not only business transactions, but it's someone who is enormously greedy, enormously shallow, and just not a person you want to spend any time with, really. And so from there, I was just like, you know what, this is insane. How can this be? Like, and I was like, this can't be. And then that's when I discovered, like, oh, there's these people who've felt the same way for hundreds of years, who are doubting that he even wrote these works. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that took me down a huge rabbit hole. And I've just been exploring what's called the Shakespeare authorship question for the last 30 years. And I've changed my mind probably, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of times, you know, as to who the real true author was. So it read tons of books, watched tons of videos, got into tons of arguments with people, gone to lectures, and just been like obsessed with this, and just in terms of trying to find out who it was. I think the reason why I was just so obsessed with this and why I had to tell the story. So like, so when that happened, when I first realized that as a teenager, I was like, someday I want to tell this story as who it really was. I really want to have a story that makes sense to me, and to share it with the world. And hopefully I'll actually find the truth, right? And over the years, I was like, you know what, in 2023, on December 5th will be the 400th anniversary of when the first folio, which is like the first collection of Shakespeare's plays, were published. In 1623, there's a record of the first sale, December 5th. They don't know exactly when it was published. It was probably shortly before that, if not on the same day. And I wanted to time it out. So I gave myself a deadline. I said, okay, this book that I'm going to write, it's going to be a work of fiction, and it's going to be about the true author who wrote these works. And so I have to have it done and published by December 5th of 2023. So I had tons and tons of different outlines, a lot of different people, a lot of different characters. And so I think, but in terms of the reason for why I was so obsessed was that, again, like I've always been searching for what was really the truth, that at least what made sense to me. And in terms of like the greatest body of work to me is the Shakespeare canon, is the plays and poetry with Shakespeare's name on them. And I think the reason why it's the greatest body of work is that you will not find anywhere else a greater exploration of what it means to be a human being. And so for me, I found that in terms of what fascinates me the most are people. Human beings are, to me, the most fascinating thing about existence. And I think that we just have scratched the surface in terms of what is the reality of what it means to be a human being. And I always felt that occult knowledge and occult exploration and occult experience and practice is yes, very devotional. I have in terms of my own practice is very devotional to entities. I have a very devotional practice to that. But in my mind, it's all about how it reflects back on the human experience. So I think just like knowing the significance of this big body of work and what it means to us as a species, and how it just enormous significance of the Shakespeare canon, that I just felt like I had to have like the answer. And And so I came across the work of this guy named Dennis McCarthy. Dennis McCarthy has been working for the last 15 years, showing that there was this older playwright, this guy named Thomas North. So Thomas North was a translator who was about 3 decades older than Shakespeare. He was born in 1535. And he's known for translating Plutarch's Lives, which is about famous Romans and famous Greeks, and sort of like they're called parallel lives. So he would show the difference, the similarities between certain people: Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, Cleopatra, Timon of Athens in Greece, or and so forth, and just comparing the differences. Plutarch was a Roman. He was an ancient Roman who wrote this originally in Latin. It was translated into French by Amiot, and then Thomas North translated it into English from the French. So we just know, like, Thomas North was like this guy. Okay, he was around. He was a translator. He translated some other books. But Dennis showed through basically this computer software, plagiarism software, basically showing these texts that were translated by North were almost exactly the same as passages in the Shakespeare plays. And not just like a few examples, but one after another, after another, after another. The techniques that he used were basically the same techniques to identify the Unabomber in the 90s. And so that was a way to figure out it was Ted Kaczynski who was the Unabomber, because they looked at stuff that he wrote under his own name and the text that he wrote under the Unabomber.
These handwriting algorithms, and right, very, very interesting, And I have to say, before the podcast, I did a little research myself, because I had a while back seen a documentary, or maybe it was an episode on a series of one of those A&E or something like that, where they talk about these great conspiracies, and what I remembered from it was, I think that they had even suggested Sir Francis Drake could have penned some of the Shakespearean works or whatever. And when I went on the web and I started doing research, I noticed that a lot of the skepticism really started to kick in the mid 1800s.
Yes.
When you had people start writing books like, what is it? Joseph C. Hart, or Robert Jameson, or even in the U.S. in 1845, Delilah Bacon.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It was interesting because she was kind of like the first one, and so her big thing was Francis Bacon. So for a long period of time, it was only Francis Bacon, like through the later half of the 19th century. The next person to come up was in the 1890s, or turn of the century, was William Stanley, 6th Earl of Derby. Then you had, in the early part of the 20th century, you had the Earl of Oxford, the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. And now currently Edward de Vere is probably the most popular alternative candidate. But then you had in the early 20th century also Christopher Marlowe, who was a contemporary playwright and poet of Shakespeare. He was seen as another candidate. And then just over the years, there's just been one candidate after another. If you go on Wikipedia, you'll actually see the list that they have there is 80 alternative candidates.
It's impressive. And I mean, so many things. I mean, Ralph Waldo Emerson helped Delilah Bacon travel to England to search for evidence to support her theories and stuff. And,
sure,
you can go down a rabbit hole absolutely on this topic.
Oh, yeah.
Derek, how do you think this became lost knowledge? If all of these people participated in writing the Shakespearean works, how was there a disconnect for a few hundred years before people start questioning the authenticity of that?
Well, actually, ironically, so it's interesting because there was actually questioning of it at the time. So there was a published back and forth between these two poets, John Marston and Joseph Hall. And if you actually go onto the Francis Bacon website, the ones that question the authorship, right? They have a section, an article about this published back and forth between Marston and Hall. And what it is they're discussing the validity of romantic poetry. I think Marston is like arguing for it, and Hall is arguing against it. And then they bring up the two narrative poems that were published in the 1590s with Shakespeare's name on them. In 1593 was Venus and Adonis, and then 1594 was The Rape of Lucrece. And basically, they both say that these works were written from the house of Bacon. So they had Francis Bacon, his family motto. And so at the time, their father had passed away, so it was Francis Bacon and his brother Anthony Bacon. So that's where a lot of Baconians see, like, oh, look, see, this is a clue as to that Bacon was the true author. There's in those times there was a lot of references to each other, and a lot of it was not exactly 100% literal, but the references are there. There's a lot of satirical back and forth, a lot of poking fun at each other, and so the Shakespeare authorship question had actually started back then. But it wasn't like a real like official thing or anything, but people were questioning it back then. But when it really took off is at that period that you mentioned, the mid 1800s is where it really took off. But in terms of like, well, what happened? So just to kind of give I don't want to go into it too much because I know I can talk for a while.
You're very versed on it, and trust me, like you said, I went on the Wikipedia and I've read about it, and I just can't believe the people that are involved at that time. Also, you have even Mark Twain revealed. He wrote something that I believe is Shakespeare dead, favoring Bacon as the author.
Right. Yeah. No, you have, and that's the thing is that I think one of the things that what's called the Stratfordians, the people that think that Shakespeare was the author. The way they ridicule people who question the authorship and even call them they have a mental illness. It's a lot of like really personal attacks on anyone who even questions this, right? Because they're basically questioning the secular figure for them. It's like a secular saint. Like it'd be like if almost questioning if Jesus Christ was really a historical person or a mythological person,
But all of this is very occult.
Oh, sure.
In 1907, Owen claimed that he had decoded instructions revealing a box containing proof of Bacon's authorship that had been buried, and then all these like secret ciphers, and then later on they were convinced that Bacon had given away the key to the cipher to the Rosicrucians and stuff. I mean, this is totally immersed in occultism.
Well, and also too, people have to understand that in those days, and during the English Renaissance, and just in the Renaissance in general, there was a great deal of deception going on. There's a great deal of just like
great deal of deception going on these days too.
Oh, and these days too, of course, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And but in terms of why, so the difference between Dennis McCarthy and myself is that he believes that Thomas North wrote these plays, and he was an impoverished knight. He was poor, which I believe too. I mean, I'm with him on this. And then he sold his plays to William Shakespeare, and William Shakespeare he maybe have revised it a little bit. He just simply slapped his name on it and presented it as if they were his. And you know what? Well, if you look back in those times, this is not a strange occurrence or a rare occurrence. Like there was a lot of people who there was a guy named Thomas Watson, who was a great poet in the 1580s, and he was celebrated for being the first to translate Antigone from the Greek to the Latin. Well, that's not true. There was actually somebody in the continent in Europe while he was there in the 1570s who had translated it from the Greek to the Latin. And so he just happened to be in England, and everyone thought he was like the first one to do it. Then somebody else actually translated one of his works and put their name on it. In terms of authorship, it was the most popular play at the time, the Spanish tragedy, never had an author's name on it. It was always an anonymous play. We only know that it was written, or believe it was written, by Thomas Kidd, because there was a guy named Haywood in 1612 who said that he did. And then that wasn't picked up until another 150 years later. And they said, oh, wait, this guy said that Thomas Kidd was the author of the Spanish tragedy. So in terms of anonymous works at the time, most plays at the time were written anonymously. They also were written in collaboration. I would say a good 80 to 90% of the plays were written in collaborative effort. You would have one person who was like the plotter, who wrote the outline of the story, and then he would hand off scenes to other writers to write those scenes. The reason for, like a whole scene, like he'll have like the whole scene out, and then you'll have like maybe up to 5 or 6 different authors working on one play. And the reason for this is that the plays had to be written quickly, because the demand for plays was enormous. The theaters in those days were constantly putting on plays, and there was a huge appetite from the English public to see plays. So they would have new plays written quickly, and then they would have old plays revised, and so that they would bring in new scenes, revise this, that, or whatever. And so to me, the difference between Dennis and myself is that I believe it was Thomas North who was the true author, but he had an enormous amount of help from other people. And throughout the decades, from the late 1550s, when Queen Mary was the queen, to his death and I believe it was 1608, there's a reference to Sir Thomas North in 1607 in a land dispute in Yorkshire. I think he died in 1608, which would then make sense why the sonnets were published a year later in 1609, because anyone who's read the sonnets will know that it is very personal, right? A lot of personal anguish, a lot of pain, a lot of romantic angst, and that the vast majority of the sonnets were written to a man. So Thomas North was writing love sonnets to a younger man. I have a theory as to who that person was. It was nobody in England. It was somebody he had met many years before. But so like the idea of declaring one's love, romantic love, sexual love from one man to another was, it was like, that was very dangerous to do in those days. And that to me also opened up the door in terms of, well, what kind of person was Thomas North? So there's this reason why I called this book Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. I really do feel, and what I explore in the novel, that Thomas North was on a mission. And it really, what he was doing was really radical. The great Shakespearean author and scholar, Harold Bloom, one of my favorites, Shakespearean scholars. He just knows so much, and has great insights into the Shakespeare plays and sonnets and poetry. He wrote this book called The Invention of the Human. So what Bloom was arguing was, obviously human beings existed before the plays and poetry with Shakespeare's name on them. Human experience had already happened. But for the very first time, and it really is true, it's really hard to argue with Bloom on this, you really, for the first time, the Shakespeare canon put on the center stage, at the center of investigation and celebration and anguish, was the human experience. It was not the divine. It was not, art wasn't created for the purpose of religion or the state. And everything else prior to that had some ultimate purpose behind it that had to serve something else besides an investigation into the human. I do think that Thomas North, and I explore this in the novel, was a lifelong friend with the French philosopher Montaigne. What Montaigne was doing with his essays was also the same, basically the same kind of radical vision and radical mission, was to put human beings at center stage of investigation. And in so many different ways, like those two, for me, were the ones who essentially created like the modern era. Modern English was very much created at this time. and during, not just with North, but all these other writers who are creating words that we now use, and phrases that we now use. And it was not only the language, but the way we see ourselves, and the way that, in terms of having trust that we are worth looking at ourselves, investigating ourselves, simply for being human. And I think it took a lot of balls for both Thomas North and Montaigne to do this. They had to, and it had to be really, it wasn't just something, there's a lot of things that happened accidentally for sure, but I think there was a real deep motivation on their part that was, especially for North, that was against religion, not only just Christianity, but all forms of religion. And to put forth in such a way in his works, to declare it in that way, to unashamedly express his love for another man the way that he does, as if it was just as normal as declaring love for a woman. It was just, I think that you had to have somebody who was behind that, who did this very intentionally, almost as if it was like a big, massive sociological ritual that he was a part of, that he pushed forward. And that's another thing I explored too, is that there was definitely an occult aspect to what he did. And there's a number of different rituals in the book, and in the way he pushes this literary underground in England and gathering up other writers, and they all are kind of following in his path, and he's like he's the one pushing forward. He's the one that's on this kind of humanist crusade, so to speak.
Well, another question I had for you, and obviously you don't agree with it, but I wanted you to discuss the Oxfordian theory of the Shakespearean authorship.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I definitely, there's many times where I believe he was the one. I definitely think that he has a good case, but
17th Earl of Oxford.
Yes. So Edward de Vere definitely has a good case. He's the most popular alternative candidate. The problem I had with de Vere was that the writing that he has under his own name, it's just not very good. So that he wrote poetry that he has under his own name.
Why wouldn't the great works be under his own name? And
yeah, like
all the great stuff's anonymous.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's so what I've always felt like, okay, the bridge that has to be crossed between this person's work on this side and the Shakespeare canon, like it has to be somewhat close. So the problem I have with Thomas North is that, like, technically speaking, it's like undeniable. This guy was involved, right? And there's brilliance in his translations for sure. But the reason why I believe he had help is that he had other people who were extremely talented writers themselves, people like Edmund Spenser, Thomas Watson, Christopher Marlowe, Richard Barnfield, Michael Drayton. And so my two favorites were John Webster and Thomas Middleton, who came later. And so they came later, and so they did a lot of revising after Thomas North's death. And so Thomas Middleton in particular was at the height of his creative powers in 1623 with the First Folio. And so the First Folio is where everybody says, this is the good stuff, right? There has been published, other works have been published before, and quarto versions, which is individualized plays, and a lot of them were just not of great quality. The great texts are in that First Folio. Thomas Middleton was alive at the time. He was writing great plays just before under his own name in 1620 and 1622. Othello appeared for the first time in 1622. So Thomas North had help from other great writers. When you look at Edward de Vere, the writing under his own name and the poetry he wrote is really not good. And there's other things too, like there's a lot of different things that are there that are against Oxford. There's a lot of things that would be, if you really dive into it, you see that the person who was writing these works was in a different circle. So that other circle was the Earl of Leicester. So the Earl of Leicester was one of the Queen Elizabeth's on again, off again's favorite lovers. And probably physically lovers, I'm sure, but definitely she gave him a lot of attention. He tried to marry her a number of times, but she was not able to. And so the plays definitely seem to support a Leicester agenda and not an Oxfordian agenda. So it doesn't make sense. There's a number of things that are in there that you look at it. The people or person who's writing it was in this other guy's circle and trying to push his agenda. It seems to be completely at odds with the Oxfordian agenda, what he was trying to do in terms of the court at the time. So there's those two things for me, and just in terms of, and the other thing is like one of the problems I have with a lot of people who question Shakespeare's authorship is that they all assume that it had to be some rich earl, right? It had to be an aristocrat.
Marlowe or De Vere.
Well, no, actually, Marlowe was a writer, and Marlowe actually is a very good case. What I always tell people this is that they think that if I don't think Shakespeare was the author, that you're a snob, and because he was a working class guy and blah blah blah, and why can't you give the working class people credit? And I was like, actually, that's not true. Shakespeare was not working class. Shakespeare came from upper middle class. His father was a businessman, had money. He was born into money. He had enormous wealth. If you go to Stratford, his house was enormous, a huge property. And so Marlowe was much poor. He was born to a shoemaker, a cobbler at the time. But Marlowe, the difference between Marlowe and Shakespeare is we know Marlowe was educated. So he actually had exposure to like the classics, to literature, to great writing, to mythology, and all of this other stuff, where there's no evidence that Shakespeare was ever exposed to that stuff. And you really can't, the internet wasn't around back then. Public libraries wasn't around back then. Like access to education and books and stuff like that was not easy. So you can't just come up with stuff out of thin air and have thousands and thousands of references to classic books and other books, like if you've never been around them at all. So the problem I have with the Earl theory, right, whether it be the Earl of Oxford, the Earl of Derby, or other different earls or aristocrats, at the time, for them, it wasn't important to create great works of art. It wasn't even really important to be that well educated. It wasn't that important that their education was only to serve the purpose of their political ends at court and their positioning, their jockeying. Everything was about their status in society. And so they are very happy to patron artists, great artists and great writers, and to be seen like, hey, look at me, I've got this great writer that I'm patroning, and look at the work they're doing, and look how great I am. But in terms of the actual creative process itself, the aristocrats really had very little to do with that. It was more of the working class people who were actually the real true creators. And that came about because there had these public schools at the time that Queen Elizabeth created, because so many of the noblemen that she had in England were still Catholic. So she needed support on the Protestant side. So she opened the doors to education to the working classes. And so that way she could get more educated people on her side. And that's what opened the doors to people like Edmund Spencer, Thomas Lodge, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, all these guys.
I'm looking at the list. There's over 80 possible authors that have been suggested.
Yes.
And just some of them are Sir Walter Raleigh is listed. And in fact, Delilah Bacon insists that he helped Sir Francis Bacon with them. Also, I see the Rosicrucians are also given credit as possibly writing them.
Oh, for sure. Well, there's definitely for the Baconians, the people who believe Francis Bacon was the author, where they heavily believe that he actually was the creator of Rosicrucianism. Yeah, no, if you dive into the Baconian theory, they see him as being like, and also he started Freemasonry as well. Which I think that's a little hard to see because there's records of the first lodges up in Scotland in 1599, So I don't know how he went up there to start that, but
Yeah.
but
just
yeah,
poking around, it just seems like such it's such a interesting subject, and I can see how you got kind of pulled into this, especially with your love for Shakespeare. Because I mean, again, not to just keep, I see some more prominent figures include Walt Whitman, Helen Keller, Sigmund Freud, John Paul Stevens, the Duke of Edinburgh, and Charlie Chaplin. So this was almost like a movement at some point, too, to dispel the myth that Shakespeare wrote these works himself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all those people you mentioned, they didn't think that Shakespeare was the true author. Orson Welles is another. Orson Welles was quoted as saying like he found it really difficult to believe that Shakespeare was the one. James Joyce was another. Sigmund Freud was definitely Sigmund Freud, and Mark Twain. Mark Twain especially was probably the most vocal about it and wrote a book about it. But Sigmund Freud also as well. I mean, there's a long list of people who have questioned Shakespeare's authorship. Today you have the two great English actors, Mark Rylance and Derek Jacobi, who both believe that it wasn't Shakespeare. There's been many others who come out. I think there was a Supreme Court justice. I think it was Stevens who came out and said that he looked at the evidence and he just found that it was just the case for Shakespeare is very weak. And so I think there's just when you look into it and you just take a look, there's so many opportunities to really doubt the authorship of Shakespeare. And I think that and that's where for me. I think that's where I think trying to find the truth was very important, just because I don't really want to just buy into the illusion. I don't want to just accept the fairy tale. I kind of want to know what really happened, and that's what drove me, and I think drives a lot of other people too.
Now, you wrote a follow-up to it, a companion piece to the novel Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists called Passionate Pilgrims. Let's talk about that a little bit. What was the thought behind putting out a companion piece to the book?
Absolutely. Well, because for me, we live in very busy times, and it's really hard, I think, especially to read a work of fiction. I love fiction. I love telling a story. That's my main thing. I've always just been a storyteller. With my three nonfiction books, well, besides Passionate Pilgrims, were about love chaos, my philosophy of love chaos, and those are the books that have gotten me the most attention, and I understand that today most people want to read nonfiction. They much rather just get information, find out information, learn stuff. And I totally appreciate that. And I too enjoy reading nonfiction as well. It's not my favorite thing. My favorite thing is like literature, and I'm really devoted to literature. And so Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist it's not a short book. It's over 400 pages. It's like 408 pages. And there's a lot to explore. You're exploring the life of not only Thomas North, but 13 other authors. So, and there's a lot of it's a complex story. There's a lot involved there. I do try to make the story, everything I wrote in modern day English. I'm very much about engaging and entertaining the reader, very much so. But I do know it's a lot to ask somebody to read a 400-page book nowadays. That's a story. It's a work of literature. So what I did with Passionate Pilgrims was that I had been last year, for like the last 6 months of last year, I've been writing posts about these individual authors, sort of like introducing people to who is Thomas Sackville, who is Thomas Watson, who is Edmund Spencer, who is Thomas Webster, who's Richard Barnfield, who's Ben Jonson, who's Thomas Middleton, because I do know that these guys are, some of them are more familiar than others, like Edmund Spencer and Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe are definitely the more familiar names. But a lot of people might not even know who they are. And certainly the other ones are extremely obscure. So I realized well, you know what? I think it'd be important to write a short book. So the book's only 60 pages long. and it's 14 chapters, and all 14 chapters are devoted to the 14 anonymous agnostic antichrists, the 14 authors. So you get to dive in for a couple pages each into their lives. Who are these people? Some historical background to the times. So just written in a way where it's like a good introduction. People can just kind of like jump into this world through this book. They can do it either before reading Anonymous Agnostic Antichrist, or you could read it while you're reading it, or afterwards. It's not required to read it before reading the novel, but it's just it's a companion piece. It's a very kind of like straightforward nonfiction introduction into those 14 people.
Yeah, definitely very interesting stuff, and I encourage everybody to check it out. Derek, I'd also like to talk about your other books, which are, your story, the story of Us All Trilogy, incorporates elements of mythology and symbolism. Tell us about that book quickly.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I will try to do my best to do it quickly.
No, I don't mean it in that way. I just want to get to, I want to try to talk a little about each of your other books as well.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah. No, but I will do my best to because that was a massive project. It took me about 10 years, the story of us all. There's 3 parts to it, black, white, and red. So I chose my favorite colors to alchemy, black, white, and red. And so for those who are not familiar with it, so there's different concepts of alchemy and the different colors and whatnot. But those three colors to me are the ones that I like the most. And so black represents putrefaction, death, decay. White represents purity and innocence, and red represents like perfection. And so that's like sort of like through the colors represents the alchemical process. And so because I'm I'm so obsessed with inversion, so I've just always been in love with taking something and twisting it upside down, right? So a big part of for example, my occult practice, my ritual practice, my devotional practice is Luciferian. And so I very much about my devotion to Lucifer, right? And still continuing with my agnosticism. But my perception of Lucifer is not an evil entity whatsoever. It's the opposite. So that's just one example. And there's many others.
As a benevolent deity?
Well, I created my own mythology. So like William Blake, who created his own mythology and his own concepts of figures, entities. In the story of us all, I explored this mythology through these stories, through 3 different stories. And so the basic understanding of my mythology is that the universe was created out of nothing. So the beginning was nothing, and then the male was chaos and the female Babylon. And so everything in existence are the children of chaos and Babylon. The 2 prominent figures under them are these 2 brothers. So one is Lucifer, who is the light bringer, who brings love and understanding, insights, compassion, but in a powerful way. And so embracing power, but not to cause destruction. There's another entity, which is Karanzan. And Karanzan, a lot of these things, again, I was heavily influenced by Crowley and others explore Karanzan. Karanzan is the Lord of Illusion, and so in the abyss, he's like the Lord of Illusion. And so I took that concept and I changed it so that it was basically he believed he was the true God and denied his parents. So he was this demiurge kind of figure. So for me, there's a Gnostic aspect to my practice, and Karanzan is the demiurge. So in the story of us all, you have 3 different stories going on, and they're all trying to get past the trappings of Karanzan, the demiurge. So it's basically a Luciferian Gnostic text story. It's like an epic. And so I took 3 stories from classic Christian literature, Parzival, which was written by a German poet, Aschenbach, and in the 14th, 13th century. And it's a great work of literature.
Was Wagner's influence for his productions as well, if I'm correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's a great book. It's probably my favorite Arthurian romance book written. It's
I
a
think it's
really
also
great
the
book.
influence for the Death of Arthur, the other French
Yeah, I'm
book
not sure.
about
I
King
think they
Arthur.
were kind of around the same time. They're both very different, the French one and the German one. And so the Parzival is great. It starts off with the father character for a long period of time. So in my version, it's modern day time, and the modern day equivalent. So it takes place. It follows the uh, the father character, who's an autobiographical depiction of myself, and then it goes into the son's story, and the son is like he is the Parzival character, right? And so in this version of the story, instead of trying to find the Holy Grail, he's trying to find this thing called the eye. So the eye is sort of the ultimate goal to find, so that way through the salvation of mankind. In order for human beings to survive, we have to find this thing called the eye. When you don't know what it is, if it's an object or just an idea or a deity or whatnot. The second book is our second story is the Divine Chaos, and that is another inversion of the classic tale, the Divine Comedy by Dante, and which again, masterpiece of literature. Dante, brilliance, really, but I took the Dante's Divine Comedy and I flipped it upside down, and so instead of it being about hell, purgatory, and heaven, with Virgil as the guide, it became another autobiographical character. So the lead character is based on me, and the guide is Austin Osman Spare. So Spare has been enormously important to me, as for many others. And so I wanted to have the exploration of the afterlife have Spare as the guide. And I really loved his concept of neither, neither, because what happens in that story is that you find heaven and hell coexist side by side in the afterlife. And it's all based on terms of the psychological standpoint of the individual. So as they go through the afterlife, they're going through meeting all these different characters. Some of them are autobiographical. Some of the people that the character knew in his life, and the goal for him is to reach the eye as well. And so he's trying to find, in order to get back to the land of the living, it's not about unification with God, but to come to contact with this thing called the eye. And then the third story was based on the Faust myth. So definitely heavily influenced by Goethe's Faust, the two parts of Faust that he wrote. So the big impact on me. Goethe is one of my favorite writers. I love Goethe. But even with his play Faust, again, another masterpiece, there was something about it I wanted to change. So in this version of Faust, he's a magician, he's a wizard, he's a practitioner, but he also, part of his practice is alchemy. And so what he believes, this Faust believes, is that the philosopher's stone is actually this ancient drug called soma. And so in order to actually create the philosopher's stone, right, which is the ultimate goal of alchemists, was that for him to discover how to create soma, this ancient drug. So at the beginning of this tale, God is actually Karanzan, this demiurge, right, this dictator in the sky. And so he sends Mephistopheles to stop Faust from creating this drug, because this drug would help to liberate Faust and humanity from the chains of the demiurge, to have a real true Gnostic liberation. So that story it's done like, and again, very similar to Goethe, this kind of comedic, humorous relationship that's built and developed between Faust and Mephistopheles, and this version of the tale, it's not a morality about Faust being an overreacher and trying to get too much knowledge and then falling. It's actually him being basically like a Gnostic revolutionary, and trying to free mankind from the chains of the demiurge, Charonzon. And so he's on a quest to do this, but of course, a lot of bad stuff happens. He falls in love with this young girl, like in the Goethe version, and then she gets killed. And so they're really the demiurge and Mephistopheles are trying to crush Faust's spirit and make him submit. So it's all about this conflict between to give up and submit to the powers of subjugation, spiritual subjugation, or to fight back and to actually, believe in oneself and believe in one's own worth. And so in order for him to do that, he also has to find the I. So all three of these narratives are told separately from Black, White, Red. And by the end of Red, they converge. And the last three chapters, they go into the core of the earth. So at the earth's core is where they're going to find the I. And in order for humanity to survive, they'll have to actually go out into the universe. But in order for them to go out to the universe, whether it be to Mars or wherever, they have to find this I at the core of Earth. And this is what is keeping human beings alive on Earth is at the Earth's core. And so I turned those three narratives into three separate novels: Parzival, The Divine Chaos, and Faust. And then I released those back in 2022. So yeah, that was a major undertaking. I was definitely intimidated because it's like taking these old classics and doing them my own way. But it was great, and it helped me a lot to not feel too intimidated by writing about Shakespeare as well, in terms of what really happened with Shakespeare, because that was just so daunting to me, to make it make sense for me. And in both cases, the story of Us All, and also for Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. So it was just a great relief for me to complete those two projects, and now no rest for the weary. I'm right now at the beginning of my next project, which is an even bigger one, which is called The Human Drama, which is a 20-year project. Is 78 short stories about the 78 tarot cards. So for the next 20 years, I'm going to be 4 stories a year, all set to be published on the spring and fall equinox and the summer winter solstices each year. The 4 stories will be coming out. 4 stories based on 4 stories based on the 4 tarot cards, and then by the end, doing all 78 tarot cards with these different short stories, these different characters.
It's fascinating. That's great. All your stuff's very interesting and very fascinating. And where can everybody go to find out more about everything Derek Hunter?
Sure. Yeah, the best place to go is the website. So it's love-chaos.com. So it's LOVE-CHAOS.com. And everything is there. All my works is there. You'll find out more. All my works of fiction are there. Also, the books on my philosophy, Love Chaos, is there. I even did some music albums. I'm not like a great musician, or like electronic music albums I did with me reading books of my first 3 books. My first three books I did when I was in 2012. But there's also some other ones there too. I did an album based on a major arcana, the first 22 major arcana, 22 tracks, electronic music tracks. And I mentioned Coil earlier. I actually did a Coil album about covering Coil tracks. And then I did a whole big, massive album about Shakespeare, where I'm reading passages from Shakespeare's plays and poetry set to electronic music. So I have some music on there. I have my dad's play on there, my biological father's play, Waiting for Amanda, on there. I've got old interviews on there that I've done over the years. So everything that I've done is all on that website, love-chaos.com.
Derek, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And when you start to put out those tarot editions or whatever, let us know and we'll have you back on the show.
Love to. Absolutely. It'll be, then the first one comes out on the spring equinox, so March 19th. But I'm going to be doing it for the next 20 years, so there's no rush. You can have me on whenever you have an open slot, so no
awesome.
Rush whatsoever. Yeah.
Great. Let's catch up soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. This has been a very much a deep pleasure. Thank you.